Aloha everyone, and welcome to Skincare with Hyram. If you don't know who I am, my name is Hyram and I'm passionate about teaching you how to perfect your skincare routine. So make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so that you can see my videos every single week.
Oh, I don't feel ready for this video.
I've been internally groaning about this one, but also trying to do the best research I can. If you have touched, even graced the skincare community, you will have seen the scandal, controversy, fire and brimstone surrounding the Purito sunscreen. It's been all over. It made international news. Everyone has been talking about it since, I think it was the end of last year, like November, which, makes sense. It was in 2020. That year was terrifying. But just in case you aren't familiar with what happened, let me explain. So if you watch some of my videos or other skincare content creators, you will have seen a sunscreen that has been recommended so many times. The Purito Unscented Centella Sunscreen SPF 50. Now I will admit, and I'm kind of ashamed, but it's not my fault. I didn't know, nobody knew. This was one of my favorite sunscreens of all time. I loved it so much because it didn't feel like a sunscreen. It felt like a moisturizer. There was no white cast whatsoever. It used innovative sunscreen filters specific to Korea, which is basically like the most advanced skincare place on the planet. Korean skincare is amazing. But there's a woman named Judith Ratz. I'm so sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. I will put it up here. Really don't know how to pronounce your name, but she's the founder of INSEE Decoder. INSEE Decoder is an awesome website where you're able to search any ingredient and figure out what the function of that specific ingredient is. And she saw that some cosmetic chemists were questioning the actual formula of the Purito sunscreen because it only used 2 sunscreen filters, 3% euvanol A and 2% euvanol T. Now, some chemists were saying that in order to get a rating of above SPF 50, that there would need to be a higher percentage or that there would need to be more sunscreen filters for it to actually be that effective. And she decided to do independent testing on the Purito sunscreen to figure out if it actually had that SPF rating. Now, independent studies can be done, but oftentimes they aren't, just because they tend to take a long time and they tend to be expensive as well. But she decided to try it out, sent the sunscreen to testing, and the results came back, and the world broke. Through the independent testing, it was found that the SPF rating of the Purito sunscreen was actually way lower than what was labeled on the bottle. And if you don't know why that's a big deal, let me explain, because it really is a big deal. When it comes to skincare in general, all different products have all different concentratives and are effective at different rates. Some products will be barely effective, some products will be really effective, and it doesn't really matter too much because at the end of the day, it just comes down to basic things like cleansing, moisturizing, exfoliation, and it's largely up to the customer to decide what strength they want. So if an exfoliating product actually isn't as high of a percentage as it says, while of course it's misleading, it's not a huge deal because you aren't hurting your skin. But here's why it's different with sunscreen. Sunscreens are so important because, like I say on my channel, it's the most important part of your skincare routine. The sun causes so much damage in the skin and is largely the biggest contributor to the issues that we see, like dark spots, aging, acne, and way more severe problems like skin cancer. And that's why in most markets, sunscreen is pretty highly regulated. If you look at the back of a sunscreen bottle, you will see that usually the sunscreen ingredients are not labeled in the same way as the rest of the ingredients. If a sunscreen is from the USA, you'll see it at the very top with the percentage. And that's because it has to go through the FDA to get approval. There essentially needs to be official tests to determine if the sunscreen factor is going to be as effective as it claims. And as opposed to just standard skincare products, it's really important with sunscreen because, like I said before, it's preventing severe damage. And with people who use sunscreen, you have all different types of concerns. Some people take medication that makes their skin extra sensitive to the sun. Some people spend more time in the sun. I'm in Hawaii and the sun is really strong here, so I need to make sure that I'm using a good sunscreen every day to prevent as much of that damage as possible. And if a sunscreen rating is lower than what it says on the bottle, you are potentially putting people's skin and health at risk. So it's a really big deal. And when I saw this, I was pretty shook. I made a TikTok about it. I talked about it on my IG stories, addressing some misconceptions, but also encouraging people to stop using it as their sole sunscreen. Now, while this is a big deal, and I obviously stopped using that as my primary sunscreen, I wasn't too concerned because I figured this was an isolated incident specifically focused on the Purito sunscreen. And that's also why I decided to wait to talk about it on my channel, because I just felt that there needed to be more research, there needed to be more information, there needed to be more studies done to figure out what happened before I speak to it. Because as we saw with this specific incident, there was a lot of misinformation, and honestly this entire situation unveiled some pretty racist responses, which is what I was most concerned about because I saw people making statements about Korean skincare as a whole that was based on completely racist beliefs, and a lot of people used this instance to push their racist agenda. So I felt it was important that I stepped back and waited until more research was done and more information was available to us. And I just want to say a quick thank you to 2 different channels that kept me up to date with what was going on, Mad About Skin and No BS Beauty. They're both channels that I love. They make amazing content. I will have them linked in the description box below. I highly recommend you subscribe to them. But as time moved forward, I started seeing other companies who utilize the same sunscreen ingredients take their sunscreens off the market. Another one being one of my favorite sunscreens, the Dear Claire Soft UV Area Essence, as well as these other ones. The Keep Cool and Soothe Bamboo Bamboo Sun Essence, the Dr. Jart Solar Biome Ampule, the Round Lab Birch Moisturizing Sun Cream, and the Hydra Relief Sun Moisture. And when I learned all these sunscreens were taken off the market, I knew that there was a really big issue because this was no longer a reflection of a mistake that Purito made. This was a reflection of potential sunscreen fraud by the actual manufacturers of those two sunscreen filters. And before you freak out and write off all Korean sunscreens, I just want to say this has happened before. It's happened in the USA, it's happened in Europe, it's happened in Australia. If you are from the USA, you may have remembered when this happened with AMA Labs. Sunscreen ingredient manufacturers overinflating their ingredient abilities and not properly testing is unfortunately something that happens all around the world, which obviously doesn't make it any better, but this is not a problem that's specific to Korean skincare. I just want to say that because I know some of you bitches will use this as an opportunity to bash Korean skincare. That's not what this is about. That's not accurate. This has happened before. And Purito responded to this whole incident by removing their sunscreens from the market, issuing refunds to people who had purchased them, and committing to doing independent testing on their sunscreens. And 2 days ago, I actually was contacted by Purito, and they said that yes, their independent tests did find that their sunscreen had a rating significantly lower than what was on the bottle. So first off, and I know some of you guys will be wondering this, why the hell is this a big deal? It's just a sunscreen. Why all the ruckus? Well, in addition to the concerns I expressed before, this goes so much further than just an individual company making a fuck up. This is an issue with a sunscreen manufacturer that was largely trusted in Korea, that actually sourced to a bunch of major Korean skincare companies. And it's interesting to me, and one of the reasons I wanted to make this video was because Purito got pretty much all of the backlash. They were the ones that got the brunt of the criticism, even though the manufacturer was largely to blame, and all these other sunscreens from different companies were in the same situation. And I will admit, part of me feels really bad because Purito as a brand has ethics that I really look up to. I've always liked them as a brand. I've always felt that they've gone above and beyond in ensuring skin sensitivity, listening to their customers, and making their products as accessible as possible. And even in the way that they addressed this afterward, they did everything they could do to solve the problem, which is honestly a lot better than some of the other companies that I mentioned, keep cool, who responded to this situation very unethically and still haven't even addressed it. Purito took the majority of the blame while all these other companies got to slide under the rug. Hide under the rug? Hide under the table? I don't know the term. But a part of me is also annoyed at Purito and these other companies because as a company, you really should be conducting independent studies and tests on your sunscreens to ensure they're as effective as possible rather than solely trusting the manufacturer and internalized testing that they do. When it comes to something as important as sunscreen, you have to absolutely make sure that it is going to be as protective as possible and live up to the claims you've made. And you may think, well, why don't all companies do independent testing? Well, honestly, the testing is a time-consuming process. It takes a while and it's typically a lot of money. And with companies knowing that they got the sign-off from internal testing, a lot of them just don't feel the need to do independent testing. And if there's one thing I hope this entire situation has taught us, is that companies should do independent testing to make sure that their sunscreens are as effective as possible. So does this mean that we should ban Purito, cancel Purito, never buy anything from them again? I personally believe no. Like I said before, I do believe that the brand Purito has good ethics and that they've responded in the best way that they can, and that this is largely reflective of an industry problem, not company-specific problem. And I think in this situation, it's important to look at how individual companies have responded to this situation and also base our judgments off of that. I have to say, some of the other companies that were involved have not responded in a way that I respect whatsoever, and I largely believe that's because they don't want to catch the fire that Purito did. And I feel like that does say a lot about those companies. So does this mean that you shouldn't trust Korean sunscreens? Well, not necessarily. There were more independent tests done on different types of sunscreens from Korea that actually found that they were very effective, even when utilizing those same ingredients. It's just the main sunscreens that only use those two ingredients were the primary ones that were brought into question. And like I said before, this situation has happened all over the world. In the USA with the AMA Labs situation, that was a disaster and definitely reflective of sunscreen fraud. And unfortunately, that's the reality that happens sometimes. So what needs to be done? I would say that companies need to take the initiative when releasing a sunscreen to do independent testing to assure that the sunscreen is as effective as possible. It's not good enough just to trust manufacturers and internal labs. Companies need to go above and beyond in testing their sunscreens to make sure they're as safe as possible. And yes, it can take some money, but honestly, I think that's a worthy price in order to ensure your customers are as safe as possible. It's not good enough for companies just to blindly trust the manufacturer testing or the internal testing. I think it's necessary for them to do independent testing to ensure that the sunscreens are as safe and as effective as possible. Remember, this is sunscreen. You don't mess around with sunscreen. I also think, and maybe this is just me being a little picky, I would love to see more transparency in the industry about the results from sunscreen tests. Love to see it when companies are overly transparent about their practices because it helps give trust to us as consumers in an industry that's so covered in marketing. Like, show us the data. I'd love to see it. What should we do? What options does this leave us with? I would say don't lose faith in sunscreen. I've seen so many people say that this is why they don't use sunscreen or that sunscreen is a lie. Not true. There are so many good sunscreens that are very effective and will properly protect your skin from the sun. But I do think that this is a good wake-up call for all of us to realize that sunscreens can be imperfect, and that just as important as sunscreen is, sun protection is equally as important. I get it. You're like, Hyram, sunscreen, sun protection, I thought they're the same thing. Actually, no. While sunscreen, yes, can be really effective in protecting us from the sun, the best thing to do to make sure you're protected is by just avoiding the sun where you can, using physical barriers like clothing, hats, staying in the shade, staying inside. Honestly, that's the most effective thing you can do to protect yourself from the sun. I get it. It may not seem as glamorous or as fun, but truthfully, that's the best thing that you can do to protect yourself. Most people, first off, aren't even applying the right amount of sunscreen. Technically, we should be using a tablespoon worth of sunscreen and reapplying that shit every 2 hours. And even if you're outside all day long, you're still going to be seeing some damage. Even if you're wearing sunscreen, it's natural. Sunscreen can only go so far. Honestly, sunscreen should be the last resort, and staying out of the sun should be the primary focus. Now, obviously, balance is important. It's important to go out, have fun, get some sun, but be mindful and be careful. Keep using sunscreen, but be aware that you can't be reliant on an SPF rating alone. There are other factors you have to keep in mind and practice. And if you're someone who does have one of these sunscreens, don't worry, you don't need to throw it out. I would just recommend using it as a moisturizer and then following up with a good sunscreen that you love. If you are looking for sunscreen recommendations, I have made so many videos about the best ones and which ones I recommend. Thankfully, each of these companies are no longer selling their sunscreens, so even if they are in my recommendation videos, people will no longer be able to purchase them. But all the other sunscreens I've recommended in my videos are great. I highly recommend trying them out. And those are my thoughts. This has been an intense video because, wow, this is a tricky topic to talk about because it's so freaking complicated. But I hope this simplified it a little bit and made it easier to understand, and I hope this will help you in your journey towards finding a good sunscreen. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below, and if you have any other sunscreen recommendations. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so that you can see my videos every single week, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Mwah.